Okay, so today I really am excited to be here with Dr. Sarah Zaldivar again because there's been this topic that's been very hot on the internet. We've talked a lot about seed oils, and the reason, Dr. Sarah, that I wanted to get your opinion on this is because I posted something about oat milk, and I hate oat milk. I think it sucks. I think it's a bullshit health food that's masquerading as something that's like nutritionally dense, and it's not. But I said something to the effect of like, it's got canola oil in it, and canola oil is inflammatory. And I got blown up on the internet by a couple people who were like, it's not inflammatory. And here's a bunch of studies and data to back that up. So I don't want to be over here just talking shit and saying stuff that's not true, right? So I wanted to bring you on as an expert to talk through some of the controversy around seed oils. And let's get into the nitty gritty. Let's put this stuff to bed once and for all. So it's not this confusing thing of should we eat it? Should we not eat it? Is it that important or not? So welcome to the show. Glad you're here.
Thank you so much, Nate. I'm excited. This is a round 3, right? This is, I think, the third time we interview one another.
Yeah. So you were on the show last July.
Yeah.
Then I was on your YouTube channel in August. And then this is round 3. We'll just do it. We'll just team up now.
That's right. I love it.
Yeah. So you're actually getting me in my office this time. Last time I was in Puerto Rico.
That's right. You're in vacation mode.
Yeah. Yeah. I was like barely there.
I remember. I know. You were cracking jokes. It was like, it was fun.
Well, so before we even like get into these studies and stuff like that, because I think this is going to be a little bit dense, I want to talk about like, what is a seed oil? Can you address that real briefly? What does that even entail? What does that mean? What are the names or examples? What are we looking for if someone says, hey, this is filled with seed oils or whatever?
Yeah. So people know them as vegetable oils, right? Like the mazolas and all that stuff. So it's either sunflower oil or safflower oil or grapeseed oil or canola oil or soybean oil or corn oil. Those are like the common ones. I'm not sure if I left anything out. Probably grapeseed oil is the worst of them all because its amount of omega-6 is the highest. But basically, they all come from seeds. And it all started really when Procter & Gamble, back in the 1900s, had a lot of waste products from cotton production. So they're doing all the cotton production, and so the waste product was the cotton seeds, and they figured that they could expand their market by turning the seeds into oil, and not only using them for engine lubricants, because back in the day we used to use those seed oils for engine lubricants, but also let's put them in the food supply. And that's when they gave a $1.5 million grant to the American Heart Association and literally put them on the map, because the American Heart Association before that were very small, like they didn't have power or influence. They weren't on the map, basically. It was a very small organization. And then once they received the $1.5 million back in the early 1900s, so that's a lot more money. I think my student did the math and accounted for the inflation. It was like over like $20 million. That's an insane amount of money as a grant. So in return, the American Heart Association started recommending cottonseed oil, known as Crisco, crystallized cottonseed oil, as a healthier fat. Compared to the competition at the time, which were animal fats, which were beef tallow and pork fat, which was lard, which were the main forms of fat that people utilized back when heart disease was almost non-existent. And once we started in consuming more of those seed oils, which the food industry likes to call them vegetable oils, but really they're industrial seed oils. That's the technical term. Once we started consuming more of those, you can literally see a parallel explosion in rates of heart disease. So that's a little background of what it is. There's no vegetable in there. They're heavily processed, and they undergo a gazillion processing steps and deodorization. And I know you're going to go over that a little bit. Before you can actually consume them. And the deodorization is an important step, because otherwise they smell so rancid, so off-putting that nobody would want to consume this stuff. So that's why they have to add deodorizers in order to mask the off-putting smell that comes out of them.
So that's a great explanation. The one that I think you forgot was maybe rice bran oil, which is what Chipotle uses, as a matter of fact, which I was sad to find out. And then, you said canola oil, rapeseed oil, and grapeseed oil. I think those are two different things. And then also canola oil is basically just a GMO's type of rapeseed, isn't it? That's grown in Canada. The reason they call it canola is because it was Canada oil. Canola.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Rapeseed is the rapeseed is the seed that gets converted into oil, and then they call it canola. That's right.
okay.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to talk through kind of what is the process on this, because I had someone else on the show. Her name was Anna Vicino, and she's all about cooking. She has Eat Healthy, Eat Happy Kitchen. So she cooks in a way that's like gluten-free and really keto friendly. So she was talking a lot about how a lot of olive oils are actually made up of like 40% like canola oil or vegetable oils in them, and like some of the legislation around that. She called the canola oils lampante, which is like Italian for like lamp oil. So I thought that was really interesting.
I love that. I'm gonna steal that.
You should also have her on your show. She is incredibly interesting and hilarious. So
What's
I'll
her
hook
name
that
again?
up. Anna Vicino, Vicino. And if you haven't heard that episode, go back and listen to it, because she is amazing.
Okay.
So what happens is they take these seeds of these nuts, right? So we'll talk about like grape seeds, right? So they take the rape seeds and then they clean them, and then they strip them of all the stuff that's not the actual seed. So first of all, they take magnets and run magnets over. I thought this was really interesting, to pull out all traces of little metals that could be there from the like, not from the plant, but from the harvesting process. So no metal, great. Then they get de-skinned and then ground up by rollers or get hammered to increase the surface area, and then crush them into and so they could press out all the oil. Then once they're crushed, the nuts and seeds are heated to facilitate extra extraction. Then once that's all done, the pressing can take place. So the heat treated nuts or seeds are fed into a press that increases its pressure. The oil is pressed out from they call it the meal, and falls through slots in this press. So they extract up to 98% of the oil from these plants, which is one of the most efficient ways of like doing this. But in order to get the most efficient, getting all the oil out, they need to use solvents as well. So some of them are going to be pressed and then solvent treated to ensure that you get all of the oil out, as much as possible out. So the solvent treatment in this article, it says you take the pressed oil cake out, because it kind of comes out thick and viscous, and adds a solvent to dissolve the oil. The solvent is then distilled out later. So they put the solvent in to get more out, then they distill it all out. Now this is already like, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead, and I'll tell you something about the solvents.
Okay, so I was saying this is already now like, you've already heated an oil, and heating oils, especially some of these vegetable oils or seed oils, can lead to them becoming rancid because they don't have the ability to like get heated and then cooled really rapidly. So that's going back to the deodorization process. So tell me about the solvents, because this article doesn't talk about what is actually in those. Is that
Right.
the
So they don't mention what kind of solvent. What solvent they're using. I would venture to assume it's something like hexane, because that's the solvent that they use normally to extract the fat from the protein portion in soy to make soybean powders and soybean protein and all that kind of stuff. So all of those, health bars that have soybean protein in it, it's been extracted using hexane, and hexane is classified by the CDC as a neurotoxin. Like, we know that it messes with our brain cells and our nervous system, and yet we're still exposing our food supply to that. Not only just exposing it, we're literally soaking our food in the hexane in order to separate the fat from the protein. It's quite mind-blowing.
So I'm glad I'm reading this article, because this is not an article written by someone who is anti-seed oils. It's kind of like this is like a how it's made.
Right.
So I'm excited. I'm liking that I'm reading this and also getting some of the different like nuance as well. So
yeah, I get my students every semester. There's a 2.5 minute video on YouTube if you just Google how canola oil is made. And it just shows you all the sludge. It's like the most disgusting thing ever. It's probably from the How It's Made episode, like taken as a snapshot. And I make sure my students watch it every single semester. And it's like, oh my God, how can anybody think that food is actually in any way, shape, or form health promoting?
Yes, but I'm glad like that's not the direction we're kind of coming from, because I didn't want anything that was like very biased in one direction or the other. I wanted to really look at something that wasn't going to like use imagery to trigger me to be like, okay, it's obviously, like I want to make sure that we're coming at this from a place where it's like, all right, let's address.
We're suspending a little bit of our common sense here. We're just looking at the data today.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to do, because there's a lot of information about this. and a lot of nuance. So I think this is going to be critical, that we're not just going into this just to be like straight up, this stuff is awful and you should never look at it. So, okay. So after they remove the hexane, the solvents, the oil is then refined to remove other stuff, the colors, the odors, the bitterness. So the oil is then heated up to, again, almost 200 degrees and combined with an alkaline substance. They don't say what it is. And this is they call this the first part of the refinement process. And then they start doing the degumming, where the oil is treated with water or acid. So any gums in the oils will be removed, and then they kind of spin it to get rid of, use the centrifugal treatment to get it out. Once the oil is degummed, then they bleach it through a system of filtration that absorbs all the pigmented material from the oil. So some vegetables, it says here, need to be served chilled, in which case the oil is winterized by being rapidly chilled to a low temperature from that 200 degrees. Then we go into the deodorization process, in which steam is passed through the oil and often a small amount of citric acid is added to remove the presence of trace metals that could shorten the oil's shelf life. So we kind of talked about a couple different things right there. There's the alkalization, there's the degumming, there's the
bleaching,
deodorization, and then there's the bleaching.
Yes.
So a lot and this is it's just giving you a high level overview of kind of what this looks like. We're not even talking about the chemicals or the other processes that are used in these 4 different processes, which they've tightened down to a paragraph section on refining.
Yep. There you have it. That's how most seed oils or vegetable oils are made. And they were never really in our food supply up until the 1900s, is when we started consuming more of them, and our consumption exploded. And it was all really driven by the fact that the American Heart Association was co-opted as an authority figure to start promoting those seed oils as healthier oils than our ancestral fat, which we ate, which was beef fat, basically, for 99.99% of our existence as a species here on Earth, when we had almost no heart disease. We didn't even have an entry for heart disease in the medical textbooks up until the early 1900s. It was unheard of.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I think that's looking at some of the concurrent things that happen, increase in vegetable oils, and then an increase in heart disease, and an increase in global obesity, and just kind of some things that have happened all at the same time. It's hard to not draw conclusions that are maybe correlation, not causation.
Yeah.
And be well, if we see both of these things happening at the same time, and obviously there's environmental aspects, people are sitting at desks, jobs, stress levels are really high, that sort of thing. Yeah. And there's a lot of other toxins in the environment as well. But it seems very interesting that there would be these 2 gigantic J spikes at the same time.
Right. Exactly. So when people, when I recommend that people, lower their intake of omega-6, and then they're well, what kind of fat am I going to eat? The saturated fats? And they're still afraid, and they still believe that is driving heart disease. But you cannot have causation. Saturated fat and animal fat cannot cause heart disease if you don't first have correlation. And throughout history, when that was all the fat that we ate, we never had a correlation between a high intake of animal fat and risk of heart disease. They weren't correlated. So if they're not correlated, that means you can't now all of a sudden try to establish causation, right?
Interesting. Yeah. It's like the, when we've been eating beef and eggs our entire life, and then all of a sudden Pop-Tarts is we're vegan, this is like a whole food, whole grains and stuff like that. Shouldn't the burden of proof be on the new food, not the ancient food, to provide environment or evidence to the contrary?
Perfectly said. Exactly. The burden of proof should be on this new paradigm of eating, not on our ancestral way of eating. We shouldn't be defending our ancestral way of eating that made us human when we were a far healthier bunch. So the burden of proof should rest on those novel foods, on those fake meats, on even the whole foods, even the plant-based whole foods. We never ate a plant-based diet. Evolutionarily speaking, we never ate a plant-based diet for 99.99% of our existence as a species here on Earth. And so the burden of proof that this is a healthier diet rests on the promoters of a plant-based diet, not on people who choose to go back to eating a carnivore diet or at least an animal-based diet, which was what we ate. throughout history, when we had no heart disease, no obesity, no autoimmunity. I mean, all this stuff is brand new.
Okay, so let's talk. You mentioned omega-6 a couple different times, and I think people are familiar with omega-3s, omega-3 fatty acids, omega-3 supplements, getting that from fish oil. What is the healthy ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids for humans? And what do we see normally from people who are eating the standard American diet? I have some answers to these right now, but I'm super curious with your background.
Great question. The optimal ratio is 1-to-1. You want equal amounts of omega-3 to omega-6. And historically speaking, that was the ratio we got. When we ate a paleo ancestral animal-based diet, we got equal amounts of omega-3 and omega-6s. The current modern American who's consuming a standard American diet is getting 20 to 25 times more omega-6 than omega-3. And that's a problem. It's not that omega-6 inherently is a bad molecule. We need it. We need it to fight off infection. If we have a wound, it raises inflammation. It helps with blood clotting, and it raises blood pressure. All those things are part of the immune response, and you need that so that you wouldn't bleed to death if you get wounded, right? So you do need some omega-6. It's an essential fat. You got to have it. The problem is not with the molecule itself. The problem is with the ratio. We're getting 20 to 25 times more omega-6 than omega-3, and that becomes a problem because they both compete for function in the body. So you got to have equal amounts. If you get more of one than the other, it starts to competitively inhibit the function of the other. And so now when you're getting this imbalanced amount of omega-6 to omega-3, now the omega-3s can't do its job. What is the job of omega-3? Lowering inflammation, lowering blood pressure, and lowering blood clotting. And so that means lower risk of heart disease and stroke and things like that. So if you're keeping the pro-inflammatory cycle going by driving omega-6 up all the time, which is what we find in our modern food supply, then you are preventing this anti-thrombotic, anti-inflammatory cycle from being able to take place. And that's the problem. It's the imbalance.
So we need a 1-to-1, which honestly, I'd always heard it was 2-to-1. We needed 2 times the omega-3 to omega-6. So this is really good to know that I was even overshooting there. And we're getting a 1-to-25.
Yeah. The Academy of Nutrition and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which was previously called the American Dietetics Association, they recommend a 4-to-1 ratio, which I think is too high. And the only reason they
4-to-1 omega-3 to omega-6?
Omega-6 to omega-3, yeah. So that means 4 times more omega-6 than omega-3. And the reason that they recommend that is because they're recommending the grains. They're not recommending basically an ancestral diet, and because they're recommending their plate, the My Plate, that's all plant-based and things like that. It's higher in omega-6, and because they're also recommending the plant oils, that's why it's almost impossible to achieve a 1-to-1 ratio if you follow their dietary guidelines. And so they admit that a 1-to-1 ratio is ideal, but they want to give out a recommendation that is quote-unquote realistic, and that's why they recommend the 4-to-1 recommendation.
So rather than telling us here's the ideal, you should conform your lifestyle to the ideal, we've once again changed the standards to reflect the poor health of the American public.
Yes. Exactly.
Like raising the A1C and like the pre-diabetes marker, like decreasing like the testosterone markers so that we are no longer forcing ourselves to adhere to optimal. We can just settle for whatever the masses think is normal.
Lowering our standards.
That sucks.
Yeah.
That sucks.
It does. I agree.
Okay. So I'm really glad you talked about the ratio as being one of the big problems, and also omega-6 as being a pro-inflammatory compound. But also, I love that you said you need the inflammation to fight off infection, to recover from wounds. We get inflamed after workouts. Stress causes inflammation. We need that. That's why you don't want to take a cold shower or an ice bath after you work out, because you want that beneficial inflammation. But you don't want too much of it. And most people are getting 25 times too much of that inflammatory compound, and the balance is skewed.
Yeah.
So I love that we're not necessarily just talking shit about omega-6s. We're talking about the right ratios and the right balance in order to have optimal health.
Yeah, it is. They are both essential fatty acids. You must get them both from your diet. Otherwise, you cannot be alive. You need the omega-3. You need the omega-6. So it's not an issue of, it's an inherently bad molecule. The issue is that we're getting so much more of it, and we're getting it in an oxidized and damaged form in the form of vegetable oils or seed oils, and that is the real issue here.
So looking at some of these studies that were sent over to me, I thought it was really, really fascinating because some of them are meta-analysis of a bunch of other randomized controlled trials, which I think is always an interesting way to look at things, is like across a couple different studies that were, so you're not just looking at one person's study that was maybe paid for by a group that had something to gain. We're looking at a meta-analysis of a bunch of different studies. And this one basically said, which I think is really interesting that they lead with this. They said there's no significant effect of higher linoleic acid, right? Linoleic acid being like a polyunsaturated fatty acid that you would get from a seed oil, right?
Yes, the omega-6. Yeah, so it's just the same name for omega-6 is linoleic acid, whereas omega-3 is also known as alpha linolenic acid.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good discrepancy there.
Yeah.
So no significant effect of higher linoleic acid was, or let's say LA versus ALA. How about that? Make it easy.
Exactly. LA, which is the omega-6, or linoleic acid. Yeah.
No higher LA intake was observed for cytokines, which is a type of inflammation, or tumor necrosis factor, and the pooled effect from 16 studies showed that the C-reactive protein, or the CRP concentration, which is one way that people measure inflammation in the blood, was not significantly affected by increasing LA intake. So there was not a lot of inflammation it was not significantly affected by increasing the LA intake.
Yeah, this is the Hong Su et al. 2017 study.
Yep, correct.
Yeah. So when you dig a little deeper into that study, they will say that subgroup and meta-regression analysis. So basically, if they further analyze their data, it shows that higher linoleic acid or omega-6 intake may shift the effect of omega-6 towards increasing blood CRP concentration. So they detect that trend. The only thing is, it might have been that they just needed a larger sample size. And another major thing is most studies that are done comparing low versus high omega-6 consumption, the quote-unquote low omega-6 consumption isn't the overall healthy diet that I'm generally recommending, going back to an ancestral carnivore diet, because those subjects don't exist. We are still in the minority. The carnivores, the ancestral movement is still in the minority. So when you're conducting those studies, they're getting a control group and they're giving them a normal diet. This still has the grains. It still has a bunch of omega-6. So we like to think of them as this is the healthy bunch, but it's not necessarily a healthy bunch compared to if I were to add an extra arm and get that other group that's following a high quality carnivore or animal-based diet that doesn't have all of those seed oils, doesn't have the grains and all of the omega-6s, because then you can really detect a much stronger effect. Another major thing is that in those studies, they're just lumping together all the omega-6. They're not looking at the differences in omega-6, right? Because you do have omega-6 found in real whole foods that is not oxidized, that is not damaged. And a lot of this, what I'm going to be saying now, comes from the work of Dr. Paul Mason, who I definitely recommend that people look him up and look at his research on it, because that's his real focus lately. And basically what he says is that it's not so much about the omega-6 molecule, it's about whether or not it gets damaged. So if you're getting it from actual meat or real whole food, it hasn't been oxidized or damaged, it's not rancid. Versus if you're getting it from those seed oils, those vegetable oils, the corn oils, all the things we mentioned, they have gone through so much processing. The reason why they have to add deodorant is because nobody would eat them. No animal, no human would eat them. That is the problem. It's the damage, the oxidation that occurs to the omega-6. And so in those studies, they're not looking at that. They're just looking at total omega-6s. I've participated in a ton of nutrition studies when I was going to school and later on when I was working, So I know what are the programs that we're using to just lump together all of the food records, and then it gives us an analysis of the omega-6. They're not looking at whole food versus damaged or oxidized omega-6, right? Another thing.
So that's a limitation of the studies. We're not looking at necessarily what the source is, right? So we're not looking at if someone's just having a big spoonful of canola oil versus actually getting it from a whole food source.
Exactly.
And the second thing that you mentioned earlier, like going back to what you said about like the ratio, the correct ratio of 1-to-1 or even a 4-to-1, right? But everyone's walking around at a 20 or 25-to-1,
yeah.
is that in that study, they literally say, like you said, like there in subjects with a more profound increase of dietary LA intake, it was going to increase the blood CRP level.
Yeah.
So they say that even though they're not necessarily showing people in this meta-analysis who are consuming massive amounts or like seeing that 25-to-1, they're still saying, but if consumed in excess, it could lead to problems. And what do we like to do in the West is we like to consume it in excess.
And that's what's happening most of the time. Exactly. And most of the time, another thing you got to remember, most of the time they're also studying very young populations. Most of these studies are done on college students, and they're in their best possible health, best shape ever of their lives. And we use them as a marker. And the problem is that you might have a lot of resistance to the negative effects of those foods, and your inflammation markers might not have increased just yet because you're still in shape. And then eventually, as you get older and you gain more body fat, then you start seeing the inflammatory storm take hold, which is something I saw in also one of the studies that we were looking at, where they basically say that, that very same study that we're talking about right now, it says, it should be noted that we can only use the average age and BMI of the whole population in each study because information on each subject was not available. So they just looked at the average BMI. So they didn't have access to more details of what percent of that sample was overweight, what percent of that sample was in shape, what percent, all those things are co-founders that can fundamentally shift and change the results. And this is why, with nutrition, it's just so hard to get real high quality data because there are just an insane amount of variables and confounders that are gonna mess up our results.
And I think that like that's one thing to keep in mind is that it is difficult to get great data, between having special interest groups paying for it and trying to shift the data to appear a certain way.
Yeah.
Who's reading that data? What is the diets of people going into this? And then like you said, just addressing do we have any overweight people in the study? Because the effect on especially what they talked about, the inflammatory markers of cytokines. Cytokines are a type of inflammation that is released from fat cells. So if you only have skinny, hot college students who, are just drinking vodka and eating cigarettes as part of their the main source of their nutritional values for the week, and all they're doing is adding in some additional whole foods, you're not going to see a massive change. If you're taking someone from, like you said, an ancestral health, a really low carb space, and then giving them the same things, what are we going to see? If you're taking someone who's got chronic obesity and then shifting them, what are we going to see? And I think those are really interesting things to keep in mind. Because we don't necessarily have the answers, the data, or enough funding to go get that information either.
So true. Because the farmers and the ranchers, they're barely hanging by a thread. They don't have any additional leeway to fund nutrition studies on people eating real whole food, animal-based diets. It's just there's not enough incentive and not enough money to fund them.
True. So I think when we look at a lot of these studies, they're funded by, like you said, the people who have the most to gain. And while that can be something that you want to keep in mind, also I think like you said, make the farmers, people who don't necessarily have a ton of funding, aren't going to spend a bunch of money on these special studies. So the studies we're going to get are going to be funded by other people who are going to do the research. It's like a medical device company. Let's say they're doing ocular implants or something like that. No one else is going to fund that study than this person or than this group.
Exactly.
And so they're going to want to see a specific outcome that helps support their product or whatever else. But no one else is actually going out there to do the work. So that's all we have to work with. So keeping those things in mind and holding that balance, I think is really, really important. And that's why conversations like this are incredibly important Like,
This is, yeah. And this is a very intentional approach that the food companies take. They want to flood the academic world with their funded studies so that even if it's poor quality epidemiology, correlation, all the problems that we have in nutrition, they rely on the fact that there's so much of them so that whenever anybody wants to say anything, it's like, oh, look at the totality of evidence. But it's still a mountain of trash, right? Trash is still trash, even if there's a mountain of it. If it's junk science, it's still junk science. And they have figured out that the best way to end a discussion or a debate surrounding a topic is to have a study coming out of some prestigious university, and everybody, people on the left, people on the right, everybody basically will always kind of like shut up at that point. And obviously now we know, because of investigative journalism, we know how those prestigious universities can be very corrupt. Like the founder of the Harvard School of Nutrition, the Harvard School of Public Health, or the nutrition department. People should go and just look him up and see all the fun stuff that you'll find out. I've done videos on him.
So check the YouTube channel.
Oh, yeah.
Well, let's put some of those in the notes as well. So I want to see that the seed oil video. Let's throw some of those up about about him. Okay, can we look real quickly? Like, this is kind of a similar study. Like it's a review of randomized control trials. The Guy Johnson and Kevin Fritchie study. They basically said majority of evidence suggests that omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, including LA, reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease, as reflected by current dietary recommendations.
It's the G.H. Johnson 2012.
Yep.
Right. We conclude. So the majority of evidence suggests that omega-6 polyunsaturated fats, including linoleic acid, reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. Here's the thing. How did they look at the markers of cardiovascular disease? How did they decide that it reduces risk of heart disease? Because what I've noticed, a common theme in a bunch of the studies we're looking at, is that they just look at total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol, and then you definitely can drop cholesterol by having more plant oils, and then they'll use that as a way to say, oh, omega-6 lowers risk of heart disease. And it's like, you can't say that. First of all, it's correlation, it's not causation. Second of all, just because it lowered cholesterol level does not mean you've lowered risk of heart disease. 75% of people who get a heart attack have normal cholesterol levels. They don't have elevated cholesterol levels.
Whoa.
Yeah, 75%. Specifically
In
LDL.
this one,
yeah.
they said they were looking at a wide variety of inflammatory markers, including C-reactive protein, fibrinogen, plasminogen, cytokines, and tumor necrosis factor.
Yeah, those are all of the inflammatory molecules, or some of the inflammatory molecules. So they did a systematic review of RCTs, randomized controlled trials, okay, that permitted the assessment of dietary linoleic acid on biologic markers of chronic inflammation, okay. So yeah, it's the same thing, right? They're using the same randomized controlled trials that we were talking about earlier, and we were talking about how when you're doing a randomized controlled trial, I've never heard of any randomized controlled trial that has ever compared an ancestral diet versus, let's say, a Mediterranean, or like the ones that they usually go through. Usually it's very close to Mediterranean versus, the diet where they'll just manipulate the linoleic acid or the omega-6 component. So they just automatically assume that this bunch is a healthier bunch, and it's like, oh, we're only changing the linoleic acid, we're only changing the omega-6 level, and that should translate into these massive changes in inflammatory molecules. And it's such a tiny variable to change, and yes, those are good inflammatory markers, but they're not the only inflammatory markers, right? There's a gazillion molecules. They're not measuring the totality of inflammation in the body, right? They're just measuring a few here and there, and they're coming out with this conclusion. And so it's just the sheer amount of confounders in all the randomized controlled trials, which then eventually translocate into the meta-analysis that pulls them all together,
Gotcha. Okay. So you're basically saying, hey, we're looking at the same studies. You came to maybe of a different conclusion, or didn't include that last line about having higher levels of of omega-6 fatty acids actually increasing the inflammation markers. And plus, you weren't even looking at all the different types. And we also don't know who's involved in the studies. So some limitations on this study. Can you talk a little bit about that's a like a review or a meta-analysis, right?
Yeah.
So looking at the one that's Ivana Jurczyk and Philip C. Calder, this is an actual study, right?
Which
Where it's
one
not
is
looking
that?
at a bunch of
Did
studies.
you send this to me?
Yeah, this is 2021.
2021. Oh, I don't have that one. It's fine. You can share. You can tell me about it.
All right. Let's see.
Weird.
So basically, they were saying that there was an association between moderate intake of omega-6s and lower risk of cardiovascular disease.
And how did they measure lower risk of cardiovascular disease?
They said most likely as a result of lower blood cholesterol concentration. So we already talked about that a little bit.
Exactly.
But
I am more worried with somebody who has a very low LDL cholesterol, right? You have a 400 times increase in risk of Alzheimer's disease and dementia, not to mention an increased risk of all-cause mortality the lower your LDL cholesterol is and total cholesterol is.
Crazy. We never hear about this.
No.
Okay. So we're looking at maybe the wrong information in terms of because cholesterol is such a interesting marker that's used to tell statins, right? So, but my question is about a study like this is what are they doing to actually say all right, you need to be getting more omega-6s. We need to be switching out saturated fatty acids for polyunsaturated fatty acids. What does that look like in practicality? What is someone eating on a breakfast, lunch, and dinner? I mean, obviously you didn't look at the study, but
basically, if you want to do that, then you would just remove all animal fats as much as possible because that's where you get the most amount of saturated fats. And you would just focus on oils. So, for example, like skim milk and maybe toast with some margarine instead of butter. I mean, there are still medical doctors who think that margarine is a healthier food than butter, with an ingredient list this long, because of the fact that it's less saturated fat, but that also means it's high in omega-6. It's pure omega-6.
So we're pulling out animal products. We're pulling out high-fat dairy. We're pulling out butter. We're pulling out meat. And we're adding in more margarine. What else?
Things like margarine, things like oils. So if you go to the American Heart Association and you look up what are healthy oils, they'll recommend the peanut oil, which is high in omega-6. We forgot to mention peanut oil and sesame oil. Those are high in omega-6 as well. So those are the kinds of oils they'll recommend in your salads. Corn oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil. That is the official recommendation. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics also mirrors the same recommendation. Those are the kinds of oils that they recommend. I know.
It's wild.
I know.
Okay. Yeah, it's just it seems like it's so backwards that I think that when I hear about people who get really mad about seed oils, it makes sense to me because it feels like if you have this knowledge and you understand omega-6s and animal products and the actual relationship of cholesterol, it feels like you're being hoodwinked. It feels like someone's trying to pull a fast one on you. And I think, as Americans, we base our entire identity on the Rage Against the Machine song, "Fuck you, don't do it. We won't do what you tell us,"
Right.
You try to tax our tea, we're going to throw it into the harbor. So when it feels like someone is trying to trick us or treat us unfairly, I feel like everyone gets really up in arms about it, maybe more so than they would do in other countries. That's my perception anyways.
No, I agree. I don't think I sent you all of the studies that show, how omega-6 raise inflammation. I'll email them to you and I'll drop them in the link as well. Because for all of the studies that we're talking about, there's an equal and greater amount that show the complete opposite. So there you go.
Who's paying for those studies?
Yeah, well, each one you have to go in and check who's the funder. There's one of the studies that we were looking at, you and I, that was paid for by Unilever at Tufts University, and that was the the Markland et al. 2019 study. The title is Biomarkers of Dietary Omega-6 Fatty Acids and Incident Cardiovascular Disease and Mortality. So it was basically funded by Unilever, who make the Hellmann's mayonnaise, which is pure omega-6. Like if you want to up your omega-6, have all of the
Get some mayo
on the
Okay, so I got this. I'll include those in the show notes as well. But okay, so I feel like it's pretty safe to say, like I think without being controversial at all, it's safe to say by limiting your amount of seed oils, you are going to have a more beneficial ratio of omega-3 to omega-6, which is only going to result in a healthier lifestyle. So whether you end up on the carnivore or the keto train or wherever you're at in your journey, trying to limit these is only going to improve your health markers because of what we know about the extra impact of omega-6s, how easy it is to consume those because they're in so many different things, as well as the prevalence of like the incorrect ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in the standard American diet and the normal American. So like without even being controversial, I feel like I can say that very, very factually.
Oh, 100%. And again, the studies that you're going to link up that I show that show how omega-6 raise inflammation, that people can see if it's going to be linked under the video. Like you'll see, I mean, they've done the test. They've looked at red blood cells, and you can tell people who are depressed don't have enough omega-3s in their red blood cells, cellular membranes. They have a lot more omega-6. And you can see that across the board on so many different conditions. There's like a host of studies that will be attaching for you to check out. So we have the data as well. It is there. It's not just us looking at, oh, look at how it's made. It's disgusting. How can you eat that? It's also science. We also do have the science to support the inflammation. And even in the studies where they conclude that, oh, we didn't see an effect of increasing omega-6 on increasing inflammation, even they will always refer to all the studies that show how omega-6 can be inflammatory. In all those studies, they'll say, we have to remember, though, that omega-6 has been shown to be inflammatory in vivo and in vitro. Yeah.
And I like looking at this. There's a study about the one I sent you actually, which is the effect of coconut oil consumption on cardiovascular risk factors.
Yeah.
There's another meta-analysis, and coconut oil, as we know, is high in saturated fats, but it would still be maybe more like along the lines of a vegetable oil.
It is a vegetable oil, yeah, but it's not like a seed oil, and so people tend to think, oh, it's healthier, but we can talk about that in a second.
Okay, I was going to say that, looking at this, it said coconut oil consumption did not significantly affect markers of glycemia, inflammation, and adiposity, like body fat percentage, as compared with other vegetable oils.
But they mess up your hormones, right? Because it's got phytosterols, right? So here's the
interesting.
thing.
Go on, tell me more about that, because I'm a big coconut oil fan.
Yeah, so coconut oil is high in saturated fat, right? And butter is high in saturated fat. So when they do the studies and they look at the effect of butter versus coconut oil, you'll see that butter raises LDL cholesterol and total cholesterol. And we say, oh, because it's the saturated fat increases the cholesterol. But then the same trial using coconut oil, even though it's saturated fat, it actually lowers total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. And the reason for that is because it's got the phytosterols, or the plant fake cholesterol. It's a form of a plant self-defense mechanism, right? And so the phytosterols in the coconut oil block the receptors for cholesterol. And so it stops your body from being able to utilize its LDL and total cholesterol. It's being actively blocked by the phytosterols in coconut oil. That's the way that the coconut kind of defends itself. It is intentionally trying to mess with your normal physiology. And so people think, oh, that's great. Let's do coconut oil because it lowers LDL cholesterol. It's like, no, it's suppressing your normal physiological level of LDL cholesterol.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I did not know that. I had no idea. Okay. So let's talk through, I guess, real quick. Like the oils I always recommend for people are going to be coconut oil, avocado oil, olive oil. What do you, I mean, obviously you don't like coconut oil. What do you think about avocado or olive oil, given that they are pure? Because I know that there's a lot of like going back and forth about even getting pure stuff.
I think they're definitely better for you than any kind of seed oil, any kind of sunflower, safflower, canola oil. They're definitely better for you. The level of processing is the number of processing steps is much lower. You can literally get olives and press them to get the oil out of them. You don't have to do all kinds of stuff to it in order for it to be edible. Having said that, I would be very careful with plant oils and just consuming a large amount of plant foods in general in your diet because of the plant anti-nutrients and the plant self-defense chemicals that manifest in various ways in different people. For some people, it causes them rashes, eczema, psoriasis. For others, it gives them depression, anxiety, or rheumatoid arthritis. And so it's hard to tell how your specific body is reacting to those plants. The only way to know is to cut them out for a while and then reintroduce them and see. You might have good, strong defenses, you know, especially if you're young and healthy and you've been breastfed and you have a strong, thick digestive lining and glycocalyx that kind of, you know, the mucosal lining can kind of offset the absorption of those kinds of plant anti-nutrients and plant self-defense chemicals. But, you know, you're kind of playing with fire a little bit because as you get older, your defenses start to weaken.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
So, like, I kind of, just to summarize what we talked about today and kind of give people some takeaways, is number one is you want a 1-to-1 omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. Most people are walking around completely out of balance with like a 1 to 25, with omega-6 being in the high end. So cutting out seed oils is only going to improve those markers. And like, because seed oils are put into so many things that are in boxes, bags, or cans in the supermarket, it's very hard to get rid of them. So avoiding processed food is one of the best things you could do, and shifting more towards eating whole foods, meats, eggs, even dairy, that sort of thing. So doing more of that, like we obviously knew, you know, eating more whole foods is going to be better than eating processed foods out of a bag. It makes 100% sense. If you want to go further than that, cutting out all seed oils because of the potential inflammation that they could be causing you. And like, we didn't even get into the mitochondria and the problems that can exist within the actual cell of your body. But cutting that out there's really no downside and a ton of upside. Yeah. The second thing is that if you have issues with you have eczema, you have arthritis, you have any sort of autoimmune issues whatsoever, cutting out a lot of other plant-based foods, including coconut oil, avocado oil, olive oil, can be beneficial. If nothing else, then to see how your body does without having those highly processed plant products, which can cause issues with people who have limited ability to digest or already suppressed immune systems. Not necessarily like you have to go out and throw out all of your vegetables right away, but if you're having issues, what's the worst that could happen? Cut some of those things out, do an N1 experiment, test yourself and see how you feel. Did I miss anything, Dr. Sarah?
No, great advice. It seems that seed oils might be even worse than sugar in terms of our overall health. At least according, I think Dr. Paul Mason mentions that. So I would also refer people, if you want to nerd out on this stuff and the studies that we link are not enough, then just check out his research because he's really focused on that.
And I do want to also say that, like, you know, we don't know. We don't know if it is as bad as sugar or not. We are still in the middle of a gigantic social experiment. And we're going to look back in several decades and be able to have a little bit better perspective on this. So do you want to be a part of the experiment, or do you want to be in the control group? Like, that's how I think about this. Like, I don't know what's going on with this. There's a lot of data that says one thing or the other. Maybe we should listen to it. Maybe we shouldn't. You know, it seems like if we lean towards being more on the anti-inflammatory train, we're probably going to be better off. But I don't want to participate in this experiment. I'd like to be in the control group. And when we find out in 20 years that everything is totally fine and seed oils are great for you, great. Well, we can talk about it then. But I don't think that's where the data is going to show when we hit that. And I'm willing to bet slight uncomfortable, or like, you know, be a little bit more uncomfortable and more particular about what I eat, because it's not that big of a deal to bet that on my health long term, if that makes sense.
Yeah, love it. And then you'll drop weight more easily. You'll just, you know, I think your health would improve anyway so immediately in the short term that it kind of gives you a peace of mind knowing that you're doing the right thing. There's no deficiency. You're not going to develop a deficiency of seed oils. I can guarantee you that. That's
a really good way to put it. I love to end on that. Awesome. Hey, as always, you are the best. Just a wealth of knowledge. Thank you so much. I am jealous that I did not get to study under you in college. I feel like that would have been just quite a mind expanding opportunity.
I am jealous I did not get to study under me in college. Like when I teach my students, I'm like, you don't know how lucky you are. You're like in the 0.001% in the world, because most dietitians are not teaching anything like what I'm teaching. They're just following. Okay, this is what the Academy of Nutrition Dietetics recommends, and that's the end of the story. Everything.
And I mean, we talked about that in our first episode. Is like how much you had to unlearn, otherwise you would have to be like doing experiments for big like food companies. That was the only thing you were going to get out of like that your degree.
It's so true. It's so frustrating, but yeah. Hopefully now people are. I'm using what I learned to be able to dissect the research and all that stuff. But yeah, definitely you most certainly do not need a PhD to get the real quality knowledge on nutrition.
Amazing.